Hello, everybody in various parts of the world. Guess I'll just introduce myself briefly. My name is Grace Allen. I am a lecturer at the Chinese University of Hong Kong in Shenzhen, although currently I'm in Taipei due to various being stuck outside of China drama, but won't go into that now. The paper that I shared was part of a kind of reimagining of my dissertation as I try and turn it into a book. My dissertation was more about French participation in foreign exhibitions and commercial exhibitions. I've kind of reformulated it more recently based on research last year to look at the globalization of the French luxury industry more specifically. So the paper that I presented was part of that reworking, where I'm trying to think particularly about the later part of the book will be about the 1980s through the early 2000s and the redefinition of luxury during that time period as France went global with its luxury production and luxury sales. Yes, that's all.
All right, and I'm Matthew McDonald. I'm a sixth year at Princeton University in the Department of History. And my dissertation that I'm working on now is about the French language and French cosmopolitanism across Europe in the long 18th century. So I actually use a lot of archives in especially Germany and Sweden, but in many countries throughout Europe, to show how the French language as the principal foreign language of the time actually contributes to a sort of practical cosmopolitanism and a shared society that has multiple effects across Europe, from luxury to the development of consumption, to sociability, and to even diplomacy, which was the subject of my talk here for the seminar.
So maybe I can say some few words. My name is Jean-Marc Olivier. I am a professor of contemporary history at the Université of Toulouse-Jean Jaurès, southwest of France. This is the city of Airbus, like Seattle is the city of Boeing. That's why I have concentrated my my research on the history of aeronautics and the conquest of space for the past 12 years. And most of the time, like you, I am in the archives. For example, André Turca archives, where André Turca was the test pilot of the Concorde, and that's one of my subjects.
Okay, so I'm gonna step in. I'm Arnaud Chaniac. I'm really glad to be here, even if it's by Zoom today. So I'm currently a first-year student PhD program, like in a joint PhD program between the Université de Nantes in France and the Université de Montréal in Quebec. I'm basically focusing on the relations that were tied between Anglo-Quebec and France within the 20th century, essentially. So the talk I gave focused on this specific subject and matter, and it aimed to give like some kind of insight of the first progress I had made through the archives, mainly at the Archives Diplomatiques at La Courneuve in France. And I'll be really happy to keep on talking with you about this talk and to share new ideas during this meeting.
Hi, so my name is Claire. I'm a PhD student here in Australia at Monash University, but also I'm doing a joint PhD with the University of Warwick in the UK. My dissertation focuses on British and French commercial diplomacies in Spain between 1783 and 1808. And so I look at who British and French diplomats and consuls were, so a bit of social history here. And also I'm looking at what their diplomatic instruments were in terms of negotiation, but also in terms of collecting commercial intelligence, and how they contributed to, let's say, the global struggle between Britain and France during the last sequence of the Second 100-Year War. And I'm very happy to be here today.
Okay. I guess I volunteered to ask the first question. So I guess I have a question for both Jean-Marc and Matthew. I noticed a lot of affinities between our presentations, and particularly how all three focused on ideas of luxury and also cosmopolitanism to a certain extent. And Jean-Marc, I actually spent a little bit of time looking in Concord archives in the Archives Nationales last summer, because the Committee Colbert, the luxury organization that I focused on, did some collaborations with the Concorde to sell luxury products on French airlines. And they also have Air France as an affiliate. And so what I thought was kind of interesting about that is that the Committee Colbert is kind of thinking about luxury and technology as a kind of combined sort of force for France after World War II. There's this kind of attempt to justify luxury by making it seem like this technological resource, or that it kind of connects with French high technology. I see that language a lot. So I was wondering if, like, what you think about the Concorde as a symbol of like Frenchness and luxury after World War II, and how, I don't know, if that intersects at all with some of that material I was seeing when I was in the archives. And then for Matthew, I think I kind of have the same question, like, what is the definition of luxury that you are working with in the 18th century? And also the idea of cosmopolitanism. Like, after World War II, I start to see luxury and cosmopolitan, I think, have a lot of connection throughout French history. And this idea that you can express yourself as a cosmopolitan individual through the consumption of luxury goods. And like with the Concorde, I saw, like, after World War II, these spaces become very global and international. Like, buying luxury goods on the Concorde kind of indicates that you're a member of this international elite. So I was wondering, like, what is cosmopolitanism? What does that mean during the time period that you're studying, as I kind of look at the changes over time? So I guess my questions are, like, how are you defining luxury and cosmopolitanism, both of you, in your work, and how are you seeing those concepts changing, I guess, over time?
So, Matthew, we can start with you chronologically.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing, it's very interesting that you found in your research that technology and luxury have been really associated in France, because I actually see that as something that's very much started in the 17th century and continued. So if you look at Jean-Baptiste Colbert, some of the projects that he encourages are, for example, the earliest version of the Dictionnaire des Arts et Métiers, and also the Parfait Négociant by Jacques Savary de Brouillon. And or you see this even with the sponsorship of the Academy of Sciences as it gets formed. And I think that having France be at the cutting edge of technology is part of what gives it this claim to a sort of exceptionalism that it sort of self-promotes in its discourse. As far as the definition of luxury and cosmopolitanism, I think it's something that's based around consumption rather than production. And it's something where I see a cosmopolitan is someone that's actually trying to not be a member of their personal community, but someone who's trying to join this larger community that is somewhat fictive through a shared set of practices. So in my conclusion, I talked about actually the Princess of Saxon-Gotha-Altenburg, Louisa Dorothea, who almost never leaves Gotha after she's married, but she somehow makes this claim to being a European and to being someone who is Francophone as well. And I think that you really do see that one thing that she does is she buys lots of books and luxury objects from Paris especially, but also from Frankfurt, also from Holland, across Europe. And it's not necessarily something French, but it is, you know, I would say that, yeah, luxury is something that sets you apart, just like in this period, the French language sets you apart. I think I have, this is what she looks like if you want to see what she is. Yeah. And then you see these pictured with the Francophone books as well.
Right, right.
Part of her identity formation.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have books too. Yes, about Concorde and the definition of luxury and the linguistic technology. Of course, Concorde was the symbol of luxury, and it was a victory of the French and the English over the American, because the Boeing project 2707 was a failure. So the only one civil supersonic was the Concorde with the Tupolev, but the Tupolev, it was terrible due to a crash during the Bourget meeting. And so, in fact, there was all over the world only one supersonic, and it was French and English. And that's why in the Concorde, you have hostesses and stewards with dresses from Chanel, and you have very good food like foie gras, champagne, of course, everything. But in fact, it was not so easy because the Concorde was very tight, so it was not so comfortable. And as you know, with the altitude, the taste of the food isn't very good, and not so efficient, in fact. But the technology was there, and you can see your speed in the Concorde, and when you with le mur du son, Mach 1, Mach 2, etc. And they upload, and you have a diploma if it's your first time in the Concorde. But most of the time, it was very cosmopolitan. For example, you have Michael Jackson, you have the Princess of Monaco, and French politician, and businessmen, of course. And what about the elite? In fact, most of these people, they don't pay themselves their tickets. For example, the businessmen, their enterprises, their groups paid for them. So it was kind of an elite, but not so true.
Jean-Marc, do you think that something you mentioned in your presentation was that the French, more than the British, were invested in the image of the Concorde as a kind of national project, even though it was a shared project between Britain and France? Do you think that's because France connects this idea of Frenchness more to luxury and cosmopolitanism than Britain does, so it was more useful for them as a national symbol?
Yes, you're right. This is a part of the answer. But the British, they were more realistic, and they realized that Concorde was a commercial disaster. So that's why they didn't agree with this. In France, everyone was very proud of the Concorde and don't care of the money at this time. Now we can realize this.
Well, I have a question for you, Jean-Marc, as well. How do you account for that sort of undying love in France for the Concorde? Because, and I say that because my husband is he's absolutely a fan of the Concorde, and it's incredible. And he can still remember, as I do, but he can still remember exactly where he was when the crash of the Concorde happened. And so, do you think that it's linked to that vanishing dream of French power linked to technology? Because my husband, at least, he's not interested in luxury at all. But it's really about the technical feat that the Concorde was and that it embodied.
So, of course, there is something, you know, you have traveled a lot, and with very long flight, and with the Concorde, it's so short, you know, 3 hours and a half between Paris and New York. It's a dream. And maybe that's why, and now it's not possible to do that. And the Concorde is very well known. Maybe even today, this is the most popular airplane in the world because you can recognize it. And all the other planes, they look like, so it's a pity, but it's like that. With the 747, due to the boss.
So may I step in? Or sorry, Claire, you wanted to?
No, go on. Please.
Okay. Thank you so much. I have a question for you, Grace, about like what you did about the Comité Colbert, and I have found like a few spheres of connections between the Comité Colbert and such technocrats like Alain Minc or the kind of persons who were like gravitating around the François Mitterrand. I would like to know, also for my own research, so it's a bit interested, if you had found like a few connections between the Comité Colbert and the Quai d'Orsay, so the Foreign Affairs Ministry, and if so, what kind of connections, what kind of did they share, like ideas or technical informations, and if so, for which countries or for which parts of the world?
Yeah, so I actually did a little bit of research in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs archives. And I found that in its earlier years, the Comité Colbert did collaborate with the consuls, particularly in North America, usually in organizing commercial exhibitions. And there were a lot actually in Canada right before the 67 World Fair.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, I did encounter some of that. Mostly it was strategizing on what kind of commercial goods to display and how to organize those displays, because the consuls, actually the commercial consular in like San Francisco, and I'm forgetting where in Canada the consul I was reading about was located, but they organized quite a lot of commercial exhibitions starting in about the early 60s and going through like the 70s. And they were usually citywide events. So like they would collaborate with like the sort of commercial and political leaders of the city in order to, like find shopping malls to collaborate with and to put different commercial goods. And they were kind of interesting because they would integrate cultural with commercial events. So in addition to, selling Renault cars or perfume or whatever, they would also try and like coordinate so that the local opera and theaters would play French themed content and things like that. So yeah, I definitely did see some overlap. I could kind of go back and look and see who exactly was collaborating, if that would be helpful to you.
Okay, thanks a lot for that.
I can say 2 words about the link between luxury and technology for Grace, because in clockmaking, that's very interesting, because this is the good example of technology and luxury, and even with aeronautics, because one of the most well-known clockmaker during the 18th century was Breguet, and part of the Breguet family, they started to build airplanes after that.
Interesting.
I have a question for Matthew. I was curious about the resistance to the use of French language, even in elite circles. And I'm asking this because in the 1790s, the British tried to sign a commercial agreement with Spain, and the Spanish principal minister, Manuel de Godoy, insists on drafting and writing and signing an agreement in Spanish. And he says that French is the language of the enemy because they're at war with France at the time. But the British, in their correspondence, say that actually it's because the minister can't speak French, well, he can't understand French properly. And so I was wondering about this rise of some resistance to the use of French for different reasons, pragmatic reasons, but also sometimes ideological reasons.
Yeah, I think that the model that I'm working on with French is actually not necessarily that French covers a certain space on the map, but what I actually call it is the French archipelago. So the idea is that there's actually a series of concentrated islands that are scattered across Europe where there's a very narrow elite that is using French very intensely. I think it's especially pronounced if you kind of compare the way that French was used in the 18th century to the way that English is used now, where I think that English is used more widely, but perhaps you don't see, for example, French people writing letters in English to their children, which you do see with French in the 18th century. I think and what this means, what this archipelago means, is that there's certain areas like Berlin that are islands that have a particularly high use of French, and then a lot of areas in Spain, for example, do not. Part of this is because Spain is a bit less joined into European commercial networks, right? Part of why these British and French consuls are doing so much work in the late 18th century, along with Prussian emissaries as well, is that they're trying to pull Spain actually into this kind of European world. Part of it's also because Spain has a literary language of its own, which is the Spanish of the Golden Age, and they have less need to kind of import a foreign language as Germany does. And then as far as resistance, I think that there's a lot of reasons that you see throughout Europe why someone would have decided to accept or reject French. I think Rahul Markovitz's work on French theater is very good in this, where, you know, for example, the consul in Spain can decide, you know, we're at war with France and this language has a certain political connotation, where someone else like Frederick II can be at war with France, but decide that French also serves his uses. So I think that in a variety of local contexts, you actually do find a lot of variation. That's part of what makes this so interesting.
Do you link that with the rise of national sentiment, for example, in the late 18th century, or
to some extent, right? So I think that to some extent, a rise of national sentiment in Germany, for example, you can see that there is more resistance to French and actually more acceptance of English culture, especially as a counterweight. I think to say that it's about nationalism is a bit simplistic, though, especially because in the revolutionary and Napoleonic period, if anything, you actually see more French being used across the continent, if only because there's French armies in Spain during the Peninsular Wars, there's French armies in Italy, there's French armies in Egypt, there's French armies across Germany that dissolved the Holy Roman Empire, there's ultimately French armies in Russia. And so actually, even though there's more Francophobia and more willingness to use a local vernacular that's not French, you actually probably in practice have more French usage, even because of this national resistance. So I think that there is a pattern of nationalism and national sentiment that weighs into this choice, but I would say that it's far from the only factor that's playing into how French works in this period.
I have another one question for Matthew. Do you know Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte?
Oh yeah,
yes. That's interesting. It's 19th century, but he's from the southwest of France, with a very strong accent from the south of France, as you know. And your communication was very interesting because it reminds me that this practice of French in diplomatic circles helped Bernadotte, Marshal of Napoleon, a lot when he became Crown Prince of Sweden in 1810. He spoke neither Swedish nor English, and he was not encouraged to speak Swedish because his only speech in that language, delivered with a southern French accent, triggered a general hilarity. So he stopped. And however, he was able to rule his kingdom very effectively until 1844, from 1810 to 1844, because all his ministers in Stockholm and key members of the court spoke French. So that was easy for him. That's very interesting. And
Bernadette actually is, Bernadette's fascinating because actually it's exactly like you said. What's funny with Bernadette is that he's born from a fairly wealthy family, but it's still a bourgeois family, right? His father is, I think, like notary, but right, he doesn't have a title of nobility. And he does have this Gascon accent. And so actually a lot of the conservative Swedish families, I found when I went to Sweden and did research, actually resisted Bernadette and said, oh, he actually has this kind of strange accent. You know, he's not really one of us, which is paradoxical because he's the French one and they aren't. And then you do see at the same time, once Bernadette kind of becomes accepted in Sweden, he actually pulls on a lot of these older French-speaking families and older French-speaking nobility in order to kind of run his empire. And it definitely gives his regime a very distinctive flavor. And it's, this paradox of how he's French, but not one of those French people where the Swedes are. And there is actually a lot of tension that's very class-based.
I didn't know that. That's interesting. I see. Excellent.
I guess actually one question I was wondering with Grace, Arnaud, and Claire, because you all really were working in diplomatic archives and looking at consular correspondence and looking at kind of the role of the state in shaping a lot of economic relations, especially, I guess, what would you say is the role of the state in a lot of these? Because I think it's very easy to see everything from the consul's point of view when you look in archives, but there is this whole question of, are the consuls actually directing affairs? Are they kind of just managing things that's mostly arranged by what we could call either kind of commercial interests in the 18th century or big business in the 20th century, or the big families in the Montreal context? Or kind of, I guess, what's the role of the state in these archives that you guys have been going through and the research that you've been doing?
You want to go first, Grace, or?
You can go ahead. I think a
Okay.
minute.
It's a very complex question because well, it depends on which consul you're looking at, because in the case of Spain, you have seaports that are way more important in terms of commercial matters than others. Some are absolutely a capital for both British and French trade. So it depends on the influence that the consul may have, on the relationship that he can have with both the embassy and also people in Paris or in London, if he has any social clout, if he has patrons, powerful patrons. And so to go back to your question about the exact influence of the state in those matters, it's a very complex question, because who exactly is the state? Is it the minister? Is it the lobbying interests, for example, who petitioned the parliament in London? And you have also different factions within each government. And it depends also on the time you're looking at. If it's the 1780s, for example, yes, definitely the London and Paris, well, Versailles have a strong influence on what their consuls can and cannot do, especially in the case of the French consuls, of course, because British are more independent, so to speak. But in the 1790s, it's actually, I think, the reverse. And the historian looking at the archives may think, just based on the documents, that the minister, for example, is very powerful in the 1790s, but it might be just a figure of speech, you know. It's just orders that are sent out from Paris, but on the ground in Spain, I'm not so sure that they are really followed closely. And so the agency that the consuls can actually use to their own advantage is quite important. So yeah, sorry, I actually answer your question with more questions.
Yeah, I think in the case of luxury goods, particularly when the Comité Colbert was formed, they chose the name Colbert as a way to evoke the importance that commerce played in France's economy and France's image internationally. And particularly right after the war, I think there's this fear that France would turn away from its traditional industries and towards high technology, which is one of the reasons in their rhetoric they try and combine these ideas of, oh, well, the state should be interested in luxury goods because it is kind of a new technology. We're using these new innovative processes to mass produce goods. And also France's image is so connected. So for them, they were kind of lobbying the government to be more interested. And when it comes to the consuls, I think they recognize that. And so the commercial consulars in the US in particular will, you know, when they see opportunities to promote commercial goods or create cultural events, they'll often try and integrate a commercial element into it, since luxury and culture are so integrated in kind of France's identity abroad, or the way it promotes itself abroad. So I feel like it was usually, it's hard to tell like who would initiate a lot of these you know, exhibitions and events, but usually they benefited the state and commerce, so they kind of promoted each other.
They had a relationship.
And so as far as I can tell on the field I study, so I guess you can find like quite easily an embodiment of the state when you work on the Ministère des Affaires étrangères, which would be in my case the Direction d'Amérique, which is like the head of all the consuls who work in America or in Northern America. And because the Direction d'Amérique was supposed to obey very closely to both the Élysée and the Assemblée nationale, which is like these are the two main political corps in France. So, so if we say that the Direction d'Amérique embodies the state, there are usually fights and frictions between the consuls in Montreal, especially, even in Toronto from time to time, and the Direction d'Amérique, because the consuls tend to think they have some kind of expertise, like they know where they are and they know like the realities of the place where they are, the realities of their circumscription too. They often do like a lot of some like field investigation to know how the French people are living in the circumscription they're supposed to take care of, and they know all that kind of like power networks that exist where they are, which is most of the case it's most of the time not the case for the Direction d'Amérique. And so usually you can see that the consuls tend to fight against the Direction d'Amérique and tend to say that they have the legitimacy to decide what's good for France rather than their hierarchy. Also, to complete a bit what Claire used to say, there's that big problem about power delegation, generally speaking. And I'd say that it not only depends on the geographical location of the consulate you look at, but it also depends on the personality of the consul, as far as I can tell. It's probably something you can observe more easily for 20th century than for older archives, because like I don't really know how it works for like early modern, but it's definitely something I can guess as far as I'm concerned from the archives I'm looking at.
So Grace, I can show you a new book about what we call Colbertism in French. And we use this word for the aeronautics because the state is everywhere in this kind of industry. And the word Colbertism is very well known in France, and particularly in economic history. And you have, maybe you can see it, you have this book, new book, Colbert, une source d'inspiration pour les décideurs d'aujourd'hui, État, entreprises, échanges internationaux, sciences, culture. The author is one of my friend, Marc Daniel Seifert. Maybe I can ask him to send you the book.
Yeah, that would be very helpful. Yeah, there's a lot of discussion about Colbert and what he symbolizes for France in the Committee Colbert literature. Yes. It's funny because he was a mercantilist, but they kind of want to use him as this symbol of kind of capitalistic, globalism, like something that I don't think he would have necessarily supported. So it's kind of interesting.
But today it's a little bit hard for Colbert because, due to the slave trade problem and the statues of Colbert everywhere.
Yeah, I think it's basically about 30 minutes. So I think if anyone has any last comments to wrap up, this would be a great time to contribute.
I had one quick question for Arnaud, because I was curious about how you got to your research topic and what kind of reactions it elicits from people in Canada and in France, because it can be a touchy or sensitive topic.
Yeah, definitely. So I came to my subject after I was a course lecturer in McGill University, which is one of the major Anglophone universities in Quebec. It's located in Montreal. And I found that there was that big loophole in the historiography of the France-Quebec relations. And so the main paradox to my mind was that the Quebec elite is definitely Anglophone, especially when you come and give a look at the economic power and the economic elite and the commercial and financial elite too. But mainly all the historiography, and mainly the Francophone one, dealt with the Francophone continuity, what we call the fait français in the Quebec historiography. And usually if you want to tie diplomatic bounds or international relations with one province or one country, you usually have to deal with financial and commercial elites rather than on communities that are based throughout like a political or speech identity. So that's the paradox I was focusing on. And as far as the reaction I could gather since the beginning of my PhD, I'd say that in Quebec in particular, the first reaction is, why do you do this? Why are Anglophone interesting? And so the first question is why? And I think that in France, the first question is rather, how. And to put it in another way, people just say, but like, do people speak English in Quebec? Is there such a thing as English Quebec? So in France, most of the time, and mainly like when you talk to European people, they're just surprised by the fact that Quebec is not 100% Francophone. Whereas in Quebec, people tend to, like Francophone Quebecers tend to despise a little bit the topic and tend to think it's not something that's worth focusing on because English Quebec embodies some kind of colonialism and imperialism. So they can't really understand the point. Mainly, so as far as I can tell, the people who get like really enthusiastic about such a topic are basically the Anglophones in Quebec, who just think, like, for once, people just tend to think about us. So I don't know yet. Yeah.
I kind of had the same question for you, Claire. I was curious how you got interested in your topic.
Well, first I was interested in the Spanish 18th century because it's the century that is not as looked at as the rest of the early modern period for Spain. And I knew that I wanted to do my PhD in British or Australian university. And because I knew that I could work with the archives in French, in British and in Spanish, sorry. Well, then I just tried to find a topic that combined the three different languages, but also the three different historiographies, the three different approaches. And one of the things that really struck me at first was the fact that the historiography in each country was, of course, excellent, but they were not necessarily talking to one another. And so trying to combine all of that and trying to look at the global struggle between Britain and France, but through a third party, that is Spain. I thought that it was a refreshing approach. And also I wanted to go a bit beyond, not beyond, but against the tide, let's say, because if you look at British and French history, most people look at the Caribbean or the Atlantic theater, and I wanted to go back to the peninsula, actually, and look at what actually diplomats and consuls were doing on the ground. That's one of the reasons.
All right, so I think that wraps everything up pretty much. So yeah, thanks everyone for coming. This was really fascinating for me, and I hope that you guys got a lot out of it too. And I hope we get to all go to New Zealand together someday.
Yeah.